Thank you so much. And before I start, I want to pay my respects to the people on whose land we meet this morning. My name is Terence Wesley-Smith, and I'm a professor emeritus at the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. I think that means I'm retired, but here I am anyway, to help launch this volume, which Graham and I have been working on since way back in 2018. And if you remember 2018, Ralph made some comments about that era. It was the time that the Trump administration announced their Indo-Pacific policy. It was the year that there was a big debate about the Chinese base on Luganville on Santo Island. It was the year that Australia government announced its step up. So there was a lot happening in 2018. And it seemed clear to us that we were looking at a new era of China's rise in the Pacific Islands region, particularly the beginning of serious great power competition. Serious and perhaps dangerous great power competition. So that was the motivation. That was the time where we thought we needed to have a reevaluation of existing narratives, that they should be rigorous, they should be accessible, and they should change the focus of the narrative. So it was more about what all of this meant for Pacific Island countries and peoples, not just for those external powers who are competing in this arena. The major question that we posed in the book, in the introduction that Graham and I wrote, was whether Pacific Island leaders, in the face of this increasing competition, could retain their agency, could retain their sovereign agency in the face of all of these competing pressures. And we raised the possibility that although Pacific leaders had been very successful in the past, had a very strong record of leveraging such competition, for example, during the Cold War, that there was a distinct possibility of that if the competition got too intense, then there might be a situation where that agency was lost, and that Pacific countries were under a lot of pressure to take sides in this competition. And I think actually we're looking at the beginning of that situation right now. There are lots of challenges with this project. I might mention some of them just by way of background. It's a highly complex subject matter. To understand China's rise, its incredible transformation over the last 40 years is challenging in itself. To understand what its motivations are in the Pacific and elsewhere in the world. And on the other side of the equation, to understand the Pacific, its vastness, its diversity, the fact that it's not reducible as it often is, particularly in media narratives. So highly complex, also dynamic. We were plagued by things changing on us when we thought we had it pinned down, when the manuscript was ready to go. We felt the need to add an addendum about COVID, which was changing everything. Health was becoming another area for competition between the major powers. Governments kept changing on us. The Trump administration lost the election, or at least according to some, and Biden took over. And so there were a lot of questions about what the new administration would do with regard to China and with regard to Oceania. And as all of you know, there's a huge new interest in Washington in the Pacific Islands region. Enormous projects are being proposed to bring America back into the region, as Nick Maclellan has written about. And of course, the recent elections here in Australia, which look very encouraging for the Pacific, for climate change. But again, a new factor. What is the new Australian government attitude towards China? What is its attitude towards the Pacific, and how is all of this going to play out? Finally, I don't have time here to thank everybody who's been involved in this project over the last 2 or 3 years. You know who you are. Particular thanks to the 17 scholars who produced excellent work for the volume. Particular thanks to our institutions, University of Hawaii and ANU, for providing the resources that made it all possible. To those involved in the publication process, those who edited the manuscripts, and those at ANU Press, which brought the project to fruition despite major budget cuts due to COVID. And last but not least, big thanks to my colleague Graham Smith, without whom none of this would have been possible. So thank you, Graham.
Thanks, Terence. Right, the house rules fall to me, but I'll just add one more thank you before we roll on to the mundane details of how this all works. A big thanks particularly to Tanuj and Joe, who are our admin people on the ground here, and Foley, who's not up on screen, but at the University of Hawaii. Without none of this would have happened. DPA was left without a comms director earlier this year, so Tanuj has been doubling up as both the tech guy and the comms guy. It's been quite stressful, but he's done an amazing job. So big thanks to you, Tanuj, particularly. The program is going to be divided into 2 panels. The first will be chaired by Terence, and the second will be chaired by Stephen Jejic from the ABC. He's the Foreign Affairs Asia Pacific reporter, senior reporter, and very much across this. Yes, and I'm really delighted he's going to be joining us for the next panel. The panel chairs will moderate the Q&A, and if you're joining us on Zoom, that's you folks over there. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them. So there'll be time for questions at the end of each panel session. For everyone here in the room, just raise your hand, as you would expect, and the chair or moderator will try to get to your question. We'll have a couple of roving mics up either side of the room. Awesome. Well, look, thanks so much. I think we have actually amazingly finished the first bit of business on time. So I'll hand over to Terence to chair the first session. James, any final words? And thanks to you for being the MC that we desperately needed.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, welcome to the first panel discussion for the China Alternative Volume. I mentioned in my introductory comments that one of the challenges of this project was that things kept changing on us. So we decided what would be useful to do for the panel discussions is to ask contributors to the book to talk a little bit about what they wrote in their chapters, but to focus on updating and further thoughts that they've had since the book first came out. And we have a very distinguished panel this morning. We have 4 people. We're going to ask them to keep their comments short so that we will have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. The first person that I want to introduce is my colleague from the University of Hawaii, Tarcisius Kabutaulaka. Tara is from the weather coast of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. He's been my colleague at the University of Hawaii for a number of years. Before that, he was at the East-West Center as a research fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu. And before that, he taught for many years at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. Tara did his PhD here at the ANU some years ago. And he has a wide variety of research interests, including China in Oceania, land and economic development, natural resources and economic development, conflicts and post-conflict rehabilitation and peace building. We used to joke about Tara being the constant in certain upheavals in the Pacific. He was in Fiji during the coups. He was in the Solomon Islands during the tensions there, and so on and so forth. But it's my great pleasure to welcome Tarcisius Kabutaulaka to talk about his chapter, which is entitled Mapping the Blue Pacific in a Changing Regional Order. Tara.
Thank you so much, Terence, for the warm welcome. First, let me acknowledge the indigenous people of Australia, as well as of Hawaii. Now, Mamanahamu, Rongono Talamania, Mahita Horosai, Solombando. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate the people of Australia on the recent election outcome. And I think the Pacific Islands region is looking forward to continuing to work with Australia on all kinds of issues. So congratulations. My chapter, as Terence mentioned, provides a very broad overview of what's been happening in the Pacific, but also what's been happening in other parts of the world. And it tries to map out the way in which the Pacific Islands region or Oceania has been the site for geopolitical competition for a very long time. And so geopolitical competition is not new to Pacific Islands or Pacific Islanders. They have been at the center of this competition, since the colonial period, during the Cold War period, and we are seeing that happening again. And more recently, it is the result of China's increasing and assertive influence. And what we've seen as a response to this is the establishment, as Terence mentioned earlier, of what is regarded as the Indo-Pacific. But even before the Indo-Pacific, during the time of the Obama administration, we see the US talking about and actually acting on their pivot from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific region. The Trump administration came into power here in the US, and it enhanced some of that discussion into what we now know as the Indo-Pacific, and pulled in the US's allies, including Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand in our region. And what we see in that is the mapping of other people's interest onto the region. And in the case of the Pacific, in the case of the Indo-Pacific, it is not only the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean as well. And so powers like the US, along with its allies, map their interests onto a large part of our planet's surface area that covers the Pacific Islands from the west coast of the US all the way to New Guinea, and then across Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean and all the way into East Africa. And so I talk about how that is an act of geopolitical cartography. The fact that you can map your interest onto and also claim geopolitical control over particular parts of the world. On the other hand, we've seen China in its maritime Silk Road, mapping its interests onto the region as well. And in terms of the powers in the Pacific, Australia step up, Aotearoa, New Zealand's reset, the US Pacific Pledge, Great Britain's Pacific Uplift, and so forth. That these are not only terms that people have used, but they're terms that carry particular meanings on how they carry out their diplomatic relationship with the Pacific. And I think the big question for me in that chapter is asking, how do Pacific Islanders respond to this? What do Pacific Islanders see in other people mapping their interests onto the Pacific? And I try to argue that what we've seen is that there is a certain degree of pushback on the part of Pacific Islanders, saying that, okay, we know you are interested in the region, but this is what interests us most. And we see that in terms of the Blue Pacific, that the Pacific Islands Forum announced in 2017. And the Blue Pacific contains two things. First, is that it is a narrative for deeper regionalism. It outlines the framework for Pacific regionalism and saying that for Pacific Island countries, it is important to have this deep and strong regional connection because it is through collective diplomacy that we are able to counter some of the things that are proposed from outside. And secondly, the Blue Pacific is also a strategy that draws alternative cartography, saying that, okay, yes, the Indo-Pacific as proposed by the US is important to the US, but the Blue Pacific is important to us, both as a place where we belong to and live, but also as a place that we are responsible to. And in that responsibility, Pacific Island governments and people are saying that for the Pacific Islands, the most important security issue is not so much the growing interest of China or the assertive influence of China, but more things like climate change. Now, since that chapter was written, a number of things have happened. And I think one of the most important things is the discussions in the forum about the Micronesian countries wanting to pull out of the Pacific Islands Forum. And I think that has an impact on this idea of collective diplomacy, on this idea of deep regionalism. And also, since the chapter was written, Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched their relationship from Taiwan to mainland China as well. But more importantly, is the question of regional organization and what it looks like moving forward. And the idea whether the Pacific Island Forum is still the central regional organization, or are there other regional organizations that will take over from the Pacific Islands Forum? Or more appropriately, I think the question of what does regional architecture look like moving forward, and especially in light of increasing interest from other countries. And on top of that is the question of how this new interest from China, the US, Australia, and so forth is influencing regional organizations. And perhaps that's something that we can talk about during the discussions. So Terence, I'll stop there and let the others contribute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Yes, absolutely a lot to talk about in that presentation. What I suggest we do is we go through all of the panelists before we get to Q&A so that we then have a general discussion at the end after everybody has voiced their ideas. So our second panelist is also from the University of Hawaii. Henrikh Shadzvi has just completed his PhD in geography at UH Manoa. Yay, Henrikh. Both Tara and I were on his panel. It was a pleasure working with him on his dissertation, which took a close analytical look at the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in the Oceania, and with a particular focus on its manifestations and impacts in Fiji. Henrikh holds a degree in modern Chinese studies from the University of Leeds. He spent considerable time in China. He is the director of research at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, an NGO based in Washington, DC. So he's closely in touch with the Uyghur issue and conducts research on those issues related to the Uyghur minority in the western part of China. His chapter in the book was called A Search for Coherence, the Belt and Road Initiative in the Pacific Islands. So over to you, Henrikh.
Okay, thank you, Terence, and aloha kako, xiao hao, and good afternoon from a very cloudy Ka'u in Hawaii. I mean, I want to congratulate Graham and Terence on the formal launch, finally, of the China Alternative. It's not only for somehow coordinating, a large group of researchers and writers, but also for producing, such a milestone publication in this subject matter. As Terence said, my contribution was titled "A Search for Coherence." And in that chapter, what I attempted to do was develop a concept called flexible coherence. And what I meant by that was twofold. First is that the introduction of the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, into Oceania has given the Chinese state scope to collect a broad range of aid, trade, investment, civil and diplomatic activities under a single brand, thereby sort of shaping coherence out of its regional engagement. When I wrote the chapter, I implied China's move towards coherence could have arisen out of a characterization of its approach to the region in the early 2000s as erratic and short-term. In other words, stopgap activities aimed at containing Taiwan or extracting natural resources and the like. However, building a consistent framework for Sino-Pacific relations through the BRI has become strategically important, not only because it became clear China as a regional presence was here to stay, but also it was defining of the Chinese state's globalism writ large, albeit with some local adaptations. A second understanding of this flexible coherence I proposed in this chapter came from the perspective of states in Oceania. That is, the wide interpretation of the BRI also opened opportunities for Pacific Island governments to stage the Belt and Road as consistent with ongoing national efforts to reassert geopolitical agency and diversify its political and economic partners, exemplified in look north policies that we saw in Fiji, PNG, and elsewhere. So that is to say that the BRI offers regional administrations the prospect to co-define the terms of their relationships with China, offering leverage and alternative options to traditional powers. So that was my chapter. And so for my remaining time, I'll briefly talk about the Belt and Road as a global project, some of the regional interactions, and then the updates to my chapter with this view to thinking about the future of the initiative. As a quick refresher, in 2013, Xi Jinping proposed the Belt and Road, comprising an ocean-based maritime Silk Road and a land-based Silk Road economic belt. And it was an ambitious plan, right, to reconfigure global trade, connectivity, finance governance towards China. And also, Xi Jinping talked about BRI as a vehicle to build a community of shared future for mankind, a sort of form of BRI bloc. But trying to pin down the Chinese state's exact geopolitical and geoeconomic BRI goals, it's not an easy matter, and there isn't even an official map of BRI connectivity. However, Oceania responded to Xi Jinping's call for regional partners to participate. The principal BRI funding agency, the Multilateral Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, includes 6 regional members: Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Tonga, Cook Islands, and Vanuatu, and they're either full or prospective members. And all of Beijing's 10 regional diplomatic partners have signed memoranda of understanding on BRI cooperation, and some have even built the BRI into their development strategies. Since writing the chapter, I believe that BRI flexibility is still relevant, but manifesting in ever new ways. During the depths of the COVID-19 border closures, when the flow of labor and materials for construction projects slowed, the Belt and Road brand incorporated the Health Silk Road. It was an existing sub-BRI mechanism And in doing so, China became an important partner during that time in efforts to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic with the provision of funds, PPE, testing equipment, and vaccines. Nevertheless, based on subsequent research in Fiji for my doctorate, which Terence mentioned, and in addition to this search for coherence, I think that the slowdown in borrowing from China for construction projects in the islands has also contributed to this local adaptation of labeling a wide range of activities as part of the BRI. And that approach is not without some risk for China. Administration of the Belt and Road is centralized. However, the Chinese embassy in Suva has taken to applying the BRI brand to projects funded with private capital, generally originating in China. For example, the WG Friendship Plaza. If you've been to Flagstaff in Suva, it's quite dominant on the landscape, and that's a private investment and described as an inspiration from One Belt and One Road. And Chinese diplomats were in attendance at the groundbreaking ceremony. The branding process for BRI is not always state-led, and what I found in my research is that some private actors seek an embassy, BRI endorsement to lure investors and perhaps gain some political protection, and that doesn't always work out for the embassy. When things started to go wrong with the WG Friendship Plaza I mentioned, with concerns that were iterative, right, raised in civil society over safety and quality and encroachment, Chinese diplomats had to publicly backpedal that approval. So this entanglement of private investment with the BRI has had some interesting side effects since I wrote the chapter, and this is in Fiji specifically, with civil society actors raising broader questions about Chinese state presence, especially about perceived benefits to Fiji and how construction sites have become these spaces of exception for Fijians. And what I also noticed is an upping of Chinese embassy in Suva's efforts to fund community projects, ranging from donating sports facilities to school uniforms to equipment for youth clubs, efforts that are more in line with the BRI pillar of people-to-people links, operating in conjunction with other pillars such as policy, coordination, and infrastructure. To me, this is an indication that Chinese diplomats in the region do have an ear to the ground over some of this pushback over landmark construction projects linked to the BRI. So thinking about the outlook on BRI, so the sovereign anxieties I talked about these spaces of exception around construction sites in Fiji, I think that's a key for understanding the future direction of the BRI. In some ways, Pacific Islanders are renegotiating this idea of the China alternative. States such as Fiji have used that deepened engagement with China to partially reorganize its political and economic globalism. However, the re-emergence of power politics that Terence and Graham talked about in the introduction, the reintroduction of that power politics in the region is going to test those kinds of changes as competition and divisiveness skews narratives towards security anxieties of external actors and away from Oceania's security priorities, such as the climate crisis and livelihoods. One of the key questions regarding a now normalized Chinese state and commercial presence is how to reconcile the geopolitical priorities of national political elites with grounded benefits for civil society. The visibility of China has generated new agency responses, this time I would argue from civil society as well as state actors. The future of the BRI in Oceania, I think, will retain the flexibility I captured in my chapter for the China alternative. However, I suggest a shift to include grounded as well as state perspectives. Infrastructure will remain a core component, but I think the BRI development model of funding and building will need a little bit of updating. And whether that takes the form of Chinese construction companies becoming more comfortable in communicating directly with their neighbors, or in the form of state mechanisms of public consultation, I suggest regional governments work to make those projects directly accountable to the transformation of livelihoods, while Chinese state and commercial actors must look to make BRI interventions more responsive to local priorities, such as the mitigation of the climate crisis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Henrik. Yes, lots to talk about with BRI. Maybe we can ask Henrik later to talk about the fact that Pacific Islands were not initially included in BRI and they became included, and what were the factors that worked there. And also, if you read Henrich's chapter, there's the idea of BRI, at least in Fiji, as being a branding project. And a lot of the projects may have been in existence before BRI, but they were brought into the brand. So maybe we can ask him to talk about what actual difference it's made in terms of the volume of construction and so on and so forth. But we'll come back to that at the end. So our next speaker is Jess Marinaccio, who is originally from the United States of America, I believe. But she received her doctorate in Pacific Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. I have to say, a wonderful university, my alma mater, I would have to say as well. Jess worked with the late Terrence at Vic. She undertook postdoctoral research at the Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. She holds a master's degree in Chinese literature from the National Taiwan University and has worked as a Mandarin English interpreter for the Tuvalu Embassy in Taiwan. Her research focuses on Tuvalu, Taiwan cultural diplomacy, as well as understandings of diplomacy and indigeneity in Taiwan and its Pacific allies. She's currently employed as a technical support officer in Tuvalu's Department of Foreign Affairs, but she appears today in her capacity as an independent researcher. So welcome, Jess.
Thanks very much, Terence. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think first I am, and thank you, Terence, for raising this, legally mandated to say that nothing I say today represents the opinions of the government of Tuvalu. But I am very appreciative to the government of Tuvalu, specifically our minister, Simon Kofe, for giving me the permission to participate. I have to thank Terence and Graham for giving the volume, China Alternative, a name that makes countries that have relations with Taiwan very nervous. So thank you for that. But basically within the book, just to give a little recap on the chapter before giving an update, what I was looking at was really focusing on Taiwan and looking at one of Taiwan's more recent diplomatic strategies with its Pacific allies. So this was the concept of Austronesian diplomacy. And so the idea here is that because indigenous peoples in Taiwan speak similar languages to Pacific peoples, they're part of the Austronesian language group, which stretches from Madagascar to Rapa Nui. The Taiwanese government has utilized this to develop a type of cultural diplomacy, specifically termed Austronesian diplomacy, and has promoted this with its Pacific allies and non-Pacific allies. And basically what the chapter is looking at is kind of the failure of this diplomacy. And the failure in that, basically looking at the idea of miscommunication, that there are several levels of miscommunication when we look at Austronesian in this term and how it's utilized. And that's very interesting because it reveals a lot about the relationship between Pacific Islands and Taiwan and how the two sides understand the relationship. So from the Taiwan side, while trying to use the idea of this Austronesian connection between indigenous peoples and Pacific Islanders to increase the strength of relations, in Taiwan itself, a lot of people don't really understand the term or what it means. And there's a lot of elision with terms like Pacific, Oceanic, whereas Austronesian doesn't really refer to just Pacific peoples. So there's a lot of confusion there with how the term is applied. There's also really interesting undertones because Indigenous peoples, Taiwan is a settler colony. So Indigenous peoples make up only 2% of the population. So there are people who also see a connection between Indigenous peoples in Taiwan and Pacific Islanders, not necessarily as a positive thing. So there are members of the Taiwanese population who look at this negatively. Now, from the Pacific side, there's also a pretty wide misunderstanding across the board of, or not misunderstanding, but different understandings of what the term Austronesian means. Some people think it means Melanesian. Some people think it refers to Polynesian because it's a linguistic term and it's not one that's very well explained. So it's very interesting when I was doing my research, this was back in 2018, to talk to people about what they think this term means. And so in the end, while it was an interesting concept for people, and people did acknowledge there were similarities in language, in culture between Pacific nations and the Indigenous peoples in Taiwan, the diplomacy itself did not really succeed and did not really help in strengthening relations as much as it could, because it hinged on this term Austronesian that was really misunderstood or differently understood. And so there wasn't a unified understanding or a coherence, as Henrikh has talked about in another scenario. The other really interesting thing that came out of the chapter, and I've alluded to this, is ideas of indigeneity. So within Taiwan, the fact that these drawing similarities between Indigenous peoples and Pacific Islanders, for some people, people who have issues, racist people, was a negative thing. For some people in Pacific countries, specifically Taiwan's allies, there were some feelings that there were issues with comparing them to Indigenous peoples in Taiwan because Taiwan is a settler colony. And so there was a feeling that, well, these people, these Indigenous people in Taiwan, they don't have their own governments. They're not sovereign people. We are free people. We are 100% Indigenous within our countries. And basically, we shouldn't really be compared as being the same with Indigenous people in Taiwan. So just this idea of what exactly does indigeneity mean and who should be called Indigenous. And a lot of Pacific Islanders not necessarily, from sovereign countries, not necessarily recognizing themselves immediately as being Indigenous people. So there was a lot of disconnect there, but it ended up being very interesting to look at. Now, updates from the time when I did my research, unfortunately, or fortunately, after I finished my PhD, I moved to Tuvalu to work for foreign affairs. COVID set in, immediately the country locked down, and I haven't left it until now for 2.5 years. So I wasn't really paying attention to Austronesian diplomacy in Taiwan as much as I should have been. I do know that Tuvalu's ambassador in Taiwan took part in a number of events dealing with Austronesia and these connections. And I think that Taiwan has done a lot to change the way they deal with this form of diplomacy. It's a lot more focused on just a general cultural diplomacy than this term Austronesian. And I think that was a good strategy. So instead of making it contingent on some linguistic similarity that people don't fully understand, just making it that there are general cultural similarities is more acceptable, easier to understand for people. So a broadening of the approach. That seems to be something that's positive on that side. The other portion that I've really noticed just from being in Tuvalu is the issue, I discussed that tension with understandings of indigeneity. I've really come to find even to see this more sharply within Tuvalu and working in Tuvalu. We've had numerous instances, I'll just speak generally, where people from Australia, drafters for documents, will suggest that we use terms like self-determination in documents for Tuvalu, other terms that you would find in more settler colony settings, and or even terms like indigenous, and the reactions that you get are often, very, people are very upset or not happy when terms that are typically used for indigenous peoples within settler colonies are used for sovereign Pacific nations, because to them it represents that they are not a fully sovereign state, and that they are not independent. This is at the political level. So I think there's a lot of recognition of there's cultural similarities throughout all states with Pacific peoples, indigenous Pacific peoples, but this different level of understanding of what it means when you apply the term indigenous or aboriginal to yourself between the different types of Pacific nations, settler colonies, and obviously it's different between different countries as well. I'm speaking from the perspective of being in Tuvalu. So just that tension in how that term is applied, and so why there may be some issues with Taiwan using this form of diplomacy in there being a different situation with the indigenous peoples in Taiwan, and how people in Tuvalu who are indigenous view themselves, not necessarily seeing themselves as being indigenous because the country is 100% or almost 100% Tuvaluan. I think just the last point I'll make is, and this was something I think was brought up in the beginning by the opposition leader for Vanuatu, just the idea of, I think, cultural diplomacy kind of taking more of a hold within the Pacific at this point in time. This may not be something that really has a big impact on the big power struggle and China and the US in the Pacific. But from the Tuvalu perspective, our foreign policy, we worked really hard to integrate culture into that and really push that on other countries. Australia coming in, I think Penny Wong in debates spoke about trying to bring culture into the foreign policy of Australia as well. And so this is something that seems very interesting, and I wonder if Taiwan will get pulled up into this as well, this idea of being able to bring culture and Pacific and First Nation cultures into foreign policy in the Pacific, and the impact of that, and if that will assist Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan has great support from the US already and other countries, but will assist Taiwan in its relationships with its Pacific partners. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jess. Yes, I think lots of interesting issues there, particularly about cultural diplomacy, given the fact that we're now looking at a situation where only 4 Pacific Island countries continue to recognize Taiwan. There's a real question about pressure on those countries over, in the near term, perhaps, to switch their recognition to Beijing, as Solomon Islands and Kiribati did in 2019. So again, lots of things to discuss later on. But before we get to discussion, we're going to hear from Nick Maclellan. Nick is, in my view, one of the best informed and most respected journalists working in the Pacific. He has an incredible knowledge of the region, not just parts of the region, but the whole region. He's known for his work in the French Pacific and has written extensively about the French Pacific, but he's also very familiar with Micronesian events and developments and a whole range of other things. He's a correspondent for Islands Business Magazine based in Fiji, and a contributor to PAC News, Inside Story, and other regional media. I mentioned his publications on Francophone Pacific, but he's also the author of a book called Grappling with the Bomb, which I found utterly startling, an investigation of British nuclear testing in the region. And as you know, a lot of Britain's nuclear testing took place here in Australia, but also in what is now Kiribati. And Nick Maclellan's account from looking through the archives is really, in many respects, shocking, but well worth a look. For this volume, Nick wrote a chapter called Democratic and Western, China and French Colonialism in the Pacific. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Terence, and I want to thank you, Graham Smith, and ANU, the University of Hawaii, for involving me in this project. I speak to you from Nam, on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. My chapter for the book, The China Alternative, looked at France's Indo-Pacific strategy and the relationship with China in the Pacific Islands. It highlighted a tension between the geopolitical interests of France in the Asia-Pacific region as a global power, but the interests of the Pacific Island governments of New Caledonia, of French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna, the three French Pacific dependencies. And it highlighted a tension between France's perception of itself as joining the Western Alliance against rising Chinese influence, with the interest of its Pacific dependencies to further engage with China. And so my chapter included 4 case studies looking at this engagement about Chinese trade with French Polynesia and New Caledonia. Indeed, China was and remains the largest trading partner for these French dependencies. I reported on the small but growing Chinese interest in tourism and the hotel sector in the Pacific. There was a study of New Caledonia's nickel industry with China as the key export market for nickel ore, particularly since Australian entrepreneur Clive Palmer closed the nickel smelter in Queensland in 2016, opening the way for a surge in exports of nickel from New Caledonia to China. And fourthly, I did a case study of a proposed fish farming project by a Chinese corporation on Hawai Atoll in Maui Nui, French Polynesia. So those case studies were suggesting that the broader geopolitical interest that the French Republic had in its relationship with China clashed against local interests for greater engagement around trade, around tourism, and other areas. Since the publication of the book, there's been some significant shifts that have adapted and updated what I wrote. Obviously, the COVID pandemic and how it affected France's Pacific dependencies is a central part of the picture. What's happened since early 2020. More importantly is about France's changing attitude to the geopolitical context. The French government under President Emmanuel Macron, recently re-elected, has highlighted that France might play a balancing role alongside the European Union in the Asia-Pacific region against what they see as the two major powers, the United States and China, at a time of strategic competition between these superpowers, as they're sometimes described in the French literature. So France is positioning itself as a player in the Indo-Pacific because of its colonial role over the three dependencies. The other big shift, however, that happened since the book was published has been the September 2021 announcement of the Australia, United Kingdom, United States partnership known as AUKUS, and I'll discuss that in a moment. It's a significant element in changing the dynamic of French policy towards China and the role of China in the French-speaking Pacific. And those three areas around COVID, around the role of France in the European Union, around AUKUS, have all impacted on the situation relating to decolonization in the region, especially after New Caledonia's third referendum on self-determination under the Noumea Accord, which was held in December last year, December 2021, and which poses a significant issue for the Pacific Islands Forum and indeed for the incoming Australian government that's just been elected. So to highlight these 4 points quickly, you know, when I wrote the chapter in early 2020, I wrote, and I quote, "The COVID-19 coronavirus epidemic may complicate strategic planning for tourism industries around the Pacific." I think this is called an understatement. There were really fundamental impacts on tourism, which is a major income spinner for many Pacific Island countries. Related to China, that had significant impacts. Local airlines like Air Tahiti Nui, Air Caledonia International had been seeking to tap the Chinese tourist market, which was growing internationally before COVID. And Chinese corporations like the HNA Group, previously Hainan Airlines, had been seeking investments in the Pacific, tourism partnerships and so on. That collapsed overnight and has not been rebuilt because of the travel restrictions that still exist around the Pacific region. So COVID had a significant way. beyond the human, the economic, the social cost of the coronavirus pandemic across the Pacific Islands, that had particular impacts on the relationship with France and with China. And so there are differences in, say, French Polynesia and New Caledonia. French Polynesia, heavily reliant on fisheries, on pearl exports, on tourism, saw a major collapse of economic interests, the closure of borders, saw a drop-off of tourism. And when tourism reopened in June 2020, there was an influx of returning nationals and also rich tourists from Trump's America. And that led to a massive surge of coronavirus, leading to a major problem in French Polynesia. Indeed, that surge in mid-2020 and a subsequent surge after President Macron visited in July 2021 has seen French Polynesia with the highest rate and the highest death rate per capita of coronavirus in the Pacific Islands. In contrast, New Caledonia, which had a greater role in self-governance under the Namur Accord, buffered the economic woes of this period because of nickel exports, and particularly nickel exports to Japan, China, and Korea. And the case study that I did about the links between the Northern Province and China, the joint venture company between SMSP and Chinese interests, where New Caledonia holds a 51% in interest in a nickel smelter in China, is still being played out. And even though the economy has been hit by supply chain restrictions and travel complaints and so on, the export of nickel has been maintained and indeed has boomed this year because of sanctions related to Russia's aggression and invasion of Ukraine. So French Polynesia and New Caledonia have reacted differently, but China remains the central market for the nickel industry in New Caledonia, as I reported in my chapter. The other big shift has been around France's Indo-Pacific strategy. And indeed, in July last year, France formally issued a Indo-Pacific strategy document, followed in September, the European Union issued a formal statement on cooperation with the Indo-Pacific region. This dates back to President Macron's visit in May 2018 to Australia and New Caledonia. Just a year after his first election, Macron visited the region and proposed what he described as an India, France, Australia axis, an axis part of the Western efforts to contain what they perceived as rising Chinese influence across the region. And that India, France, Australia axis based particularly around arms sales, Rafale fighters to India, armaments to ASEAN countries, and the major naval group submarine contract with Australia, a $90 billion contract to build a new generation of submarines, was very much part of this Indo-Pacific strategy. And there was bipartisan support from that, from both Labor and coalition governments in Australia, this expanding strategic partnership with France. But in my chapter, I critiqued this question, arguing that the conflation of Indo-Pacific security with France's colonial presence in the South Pacific was misleading. And I suggested that the notion that France's Pacific collectivities are a bulwark against Chinese expansionism is undercut by the reality that France deploys relatively few military assets in the South Pacific, mainly a small number of frigates, patrol boats, helicopters, and so on, that are used for humanitarian disaster response in very positive ways, but really don't play much of a strategic role in the broader Indo-Pacific debate that we've seen. And I think that analysis was shared to a certain extent in Washington and Canberra, as shown by the AUKUS agreement. On the very day last year, 16th of September 2021, when the European Union formally launched its Indo-Pacific strategy for cooperation, the AUKUS announcement took place, and there was a brutal rupture of the bipartisan, decade-long France-Australia strategic partnership in this part of the world. I won't go through all of the history of AUKUS. President Macron famously said that he didn't think he knew that Prime Minister Morrison was a liar. And for those who think this is ancient history, just a few days ago, the outgoing French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, said, relating to the defeat of President Macron in Australia's elections, that the brutality and cynicism of the AUKUS decision still weighed on the French state. And he talked of the, quote, notorious incompetence of the Morrison government's diplomacy. Strong words that suggest that the tensions around this are there. So there's this broad tension about France's role in the Indo-Pacific as part of the Western alliance that's been shown with the Quad, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, concerned about Chinese influence in the region. But I also suggest there are some fundamental impacts on the Pacific Islands themselves that are largely ignored in the media and academic commentary about this Indo-Pacific role for France. And the AUKUS announcement in September last year came in the midst of a major surge of Omicron coronavirus in New Caledonia. Kanak customary leaders and political leaders of the independence movement, the Kanak Socialist National Liberation Front, called for a delay in the scheduled referendum on self-determination, which was due to be held in December 2021. And when I interviewed leaders, both supporters of independence in New Caledonia, opponents of independence, they all stressed that France was really digging in and forging ahead to hold this referendum, despite calls for a delay, because of AUKUS. And the suggestion very clearly was that France wanted to send a signal to Canberra and indeed to Washington that it was still a player in the region. And so Pierre-Chanel Tutugoro, who I interviewed, a leading Kanak politician, leader of one of the leaders of the largest independence party in New Caledonia, said, and I quote, "Maybe they're sending a message to Australia and New Zealand that even if you don't want to buy our submarines, France still has a role and the Indo-Pacific axis promoted by President Macron will be maintained." Outgoing President of New Caledonia, Thierry Sonta, a French loyalist, a supporter of the French Republic, agreed and said, "I think that for a long time, France was relying heavily on its relationship with Australia to strengthen the Indo-Pacific axis. The fact that Australia has turned its back on the submarine contract has really made France realize that it's on its own in the Pacific territories." So I think the analysis that I put forward in the chapter still holds true, despite the significant changes around COVID, around France's policy, around AUKUS that have occurred since the book was published. France has strategic interests, the French state has strategic interests in the Asia-Pacific region, but the governments of New Caledonia, of French Polynesia, indeed of Wallis and Futuna to a certain extent, are eager to further integrate into the Pacific neighborhood, build stronger ties with sub-regional organizations like the Melanesian Spearhead Group. And indeed the MSG, which links Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu, all countries that have very strong diplomatic ties with China, are very much forging ahead in support of the decolonization, the self-determination agenda that's evident in New Caledonia. And I think this is a really interesting challenge for particularly the new Albanese government in Australia, but the broader countries concerned about rising Chinese influence. You know, FLNKS spokesman Daniel Goa said in March, "Kanaki New Caledonia is not a French land, as some people think, but a land of Oceania. We no longer want to be stooges of France Pacific and the nebulous Indo-Pacific axis." So there's tension between the geopolitical tensions at the global level and how people in the Pacific Islands want to address their own core agendas around development, around COVID recovery, around climate security, and around self-determination are still very much on the regional agenda since that time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nick. Fascinating set of issues there. Huge issues, actually, when you come to think of it. the tensions between metropolitan France and the local governments in its territories in the region over issues of Chinese investment, over geostrategic issues, and the impact on the whole business of self-determination. All fascinating and lots of room for discussion. And talking about discussion, we have succeeded in moving through our presentations in record time, so we have lots of time for discussion. We're due to finish at 11:30, so we have lots of space for conversation. What I was going to suggest is we have a live audience here, and we have a virtual audience. And maybe what we should try and do is take questions from the live audience and then take a question from the virtual audience. My colleague in Hawaii, Foley, has volunteered to monitor questions coming in through the Q&A function on Zoom. And she's going to help me field the questions and put them to the panel. If you have a question, it would be good if you could identify yourself, voice your question, and then perhaps suggest who you want to take a stab at the answer, or maybe just for the whole panel or for one person on the panel. So maybe we could start with the live audience and ask if there are any questions to get us going on our discussion. Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gil. My question is in response to Professor Kabutaulaka's presentation. He mentioned briefly the Micronesia-PIF split. And I wanted to get his opinion, but also the opinion of the panel. To what extent do you believe US-China competition has had an impact on the split? And conversely, what impact will the split, if it goes through, have on US-China competition in the region more broadly? Thank you.
Thank you. So Tara, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a difficult one. I personally think that, you know, the kinds of discussions that are going on in the geopolitical competition does have an impact on the region and on regional organizations in particular. The US is increasing interest in the Northern Pacific, or the US has always had interest in the Northern Pacific, but more so recently, I think plays a role in this. As those of you who are aware of the COFA relationship, it's up for renegotiation next year. And so there are discussions between the three COFA countries, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, with the US in preparation for that renegotiation. The US, as Terence mentioned earlier on, has an increasing interest in the region, and there are a number of legislation that have been proposed that focus on the Pacific Islands, one of which is the Blue Pacific Act that was proposed by Ed Case, a representative from Hawaii. The other one is the Honoring Oceania Act that's proposed by Brian Schultz, also a member of a senator from Hawaii. And there are a number of legislation that include the Pacific Islands as well. How that directly impacts relationship between countries in the region, I'm not really sure, but I think that there are discussions in the background that would influence the thinking of leaders in the Pacific Islands. I don't have any specific evidence of that taking place, but I think it is also true that, you know, anything happening at the regional level, the weakening of regional architecture is going to have an influence on the China US and US ally influence in the Pacific Islands. I think, a strong regionalism, as Meg Taylor and others stated, is particularly important in Pacific Island countries, countering the kind of mapping of global superpowers' interest in the region. And without that strong regionalism, I think it's going to have a negative impact on the Pacific. Although a lot of the relationship that Pacific Island countries have with China in particular is through bilateral arrangements rather than through the regional framework. But the US, Australia, of course, is a member of the Pacific Islands Forum. I'm not sure if that answers your question, and perhaps Nick and the other panelists can jump in.
Any other panelists care to comment on the question as posed? One of it's also occurred to me to wonder when the split happened, when the Micronesian countries just declared that they were going to leave the forum over the issue of leadership. It occurred to me to wonder what Washington's position was on this issue, and whether there was some behind the scenes activity. I asked Tara if he could use his sources to find out, but I don't think we ever did. It seems to me on the face of it that the US has a strong interest in retaining regionalism. It's a fairly no-brainer, obvious thing. If you can deal with a centralized regional organization that's supported by all of the Pacific countries, it would make sense. But certainly it was unclear at the time what the factors were beyond just the issue of leadership. I wondered if there was more. I don't know if anybody else has any further insight into that question.
I think the other thing, Terence, and sorry, Nick, just very quickly, and this is not a policy of any government, but something that certain people are talking about along corridors in the Pacific as well, is the possibility, the question of the possibility of Nauru and Kiribati being included in the COFA arrangement, and whether that is something that the US would entertain. I think the US has a handful with the current COFA countries, so I'm not certain whether they would include Kiribati and Nauru in the COFA arrangements. However, given their push for greater re-engagement in the Pacific, I'm not surprised that people are talking about that potential.
Okay, sorry.
Terence, if I could just add one brief comment.
Yes.
I think in the Pacific, there's an interest too in seeing whether the United States will follow through. For those of us that are old enough to remember, we've seen the United States pledge commitment to Pacific Island priorities, Pacific Island agendas in the past, going back to the days of George Bush and the Joint Commercial Commission that was set up and so on, which really didn't deliver. There's been a strong engagement from the Biden administration in the region. Secretary of State Blinken visiting, the Indo-Pacific Czar, Kurt Campbell, traveling to Solomon Islands recently. A lot of pledges, but we've seen this previously. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited the forum a decade ago, but the Pacific pivot was undercut by domestic US policies. President Trump, for example, refusing to meet the Obama administration's pledges to the Green Climate Fund. So I think the concern about consistency and follow through towards US engagement in the region is pretty central, and people will be watching the midterm elections in November. If the Biden administration loses control of the Senate and the House in November, will they be able to follow through on pledges, for example, around climate change, which is a really central priority for Pacific Island countries?
Yes, I think Kurt Campbell is committed to the idea of increased US presence in the region, but his problem is, his frustration is getting Congress to act so there are resources so that he can do that, to set up more embassies, to implement programs. But Congress is gridlocked, as you know, and these acts that Tara mentioned, the Blue Pacific Act and Honoring Oceania Act, they're all tangled up in Congress, and it seems unlikely that they're going to break free anytime soon. So Kurt Campbell, I think, is very frustrated with this idea of getting the resources and following through. So we'll have to see how that works out. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that Foley was going to help with these questions, but she doesn't need to because Tanoch has given me his phone. So I've got the questions here so we can cut out the middle Foley person. I have a question from Gerald Chan, who this is addressed to Henrikh. Two questions. One, why, quote, flexible coherence? And two, please substantiate China's Health Silk Road to the South Pacific. So Henrikh, do you want to tackle those?
Yeah, sure. So I think that in terms of the chapter I wrote and this idea about coherence, you know, I looked at it from the Chinese state perspective, and then, as I said, the states in Oceania and their perspective, right? So there's a lot of discussion about the BRI as having this sort of useful fuzziness, that you know, there are policy papers related to it, but its exact goals are not particularly well articulated. But that has some strategic purposes because there are a lot of local adaptations. And I believe that one of the local adaptations, in particularly Oceania, is this idea of flexibility and this maintenance of coherence. In terms of the Chinese state's perspective, it was at the time I argued it may have been a response to this idea that China was a short-term player, disruptive of the regional order, you know, sort of haphazardly funding projects. There wasn't really any sort of grand plan in what they were trying to do. Perhaps it was aimed at you know, cutting off Taiwan from its diplomatic partners, extracting natural resources where they thought it was useful. But that began to change, right? The region became a lot more a feature in China's thinking strategically, and so one of the reasons for this coherence is to collect a lot of this activity, to actually use BRI as a vehicle, as collectivizing a lot of activity out there. And you know, again, in the chapter, there's a part of it where I argued it was about legibility too. So there's a lot of activity. Some of that activity wasn't particularly sort of paying off for a lot of Chinese investors. So I felt that the coherence piece was also to collectivize some of that activity and maybe even have that legibility or some sort of control over it. But in my update on the chapter, I said that that's not really proven to be the case. And I gave the example of the construction in downtown Suva. But there have been many others that have had this sort of issue. They've been failed or incomplete projects, and the embassy has had to sort of backpedal there. So, coherence kind of took on those sorts of aspects from the Chinese state. As far as from the perspective of states in Oceania, who were at that time asserting themselves on the stage politically and economically, trying to put the climate crisis onto the agenda globally. I think that the coherence part from their perspective in using the BRI was that, okay, here's an opportunity for us to leverage relations and also to make that consistent with things that we've been talking about prior. And I've examined elsewhere the relationship between Look North, particularly in Fiji, and how the diversification of partners that's part of that, that is part of that policy, made complete sense with BRI. So it was very enthusiastically received, among in the Fijian administration. So those were to, I mean, a lot of that coherence signal is narrative, it's discursive, it's meant to demonstrate that there might be a plan out there. We're all trying to figure out exactly what China's motivations and strategies are, at least from that perspective. So the flexibility meant that it was just that lots of actors were interacting with the policy in ways that they could instrumentalize for their own purposes. And we're still left with a little bit of an incomplete idea of what BRI is exactly, particularly in the region. That's why I called it a local adaptation. And regarding the Health Silk Road, I think that, again, this was about sustaining the brand, right? I talked about the Health Silk Road being this sub-BRI mechanism. It actually began before COVID. It was initiated by the leadership in China to share its knowledge and also to provide funding and equipment. It related to health matters in all parts of the world, but COVID, it took on a new shape. And Tara wrote an interesting paper here for Georgetown that relates a lot of this information about how there were these ministerial meetings, significant pledges of funding. I think in 2020 in May, there was $2 million committed towards COVID mitigation efforts. Also, I think the Health Silk Road label got applied to sort of the government organized NGOs that operate in Pacific spaces as well, like the friendship associations too, became very, very heavily involved in, particularly bringing in PPE to Fiji and then having that distributed as well across other spaces in the Pacific. So my main reason about including that in is to show how malleable BRI is. In a time of COVID, it took on this space of being the Health Silk Road, and I see that we'll probably move out of that as things start to open up, or hopefully open up. But I hope that's some answer to Gerald's question.
Thank you, Henrik. Question over here. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tess Newton-Kane. I wanted to pick up on Tara's point about what we've seen previously, predominantly is China's engagement in the Pacific has been by way of bilateral engagements. But I think we are now starting to see a broadening out of that to possibly more regional or multilateral, I should say, engagements. And the meeting of foreign ministers is a good example. Minister Wang will be conducting the second one of those whilst he's in the region in the next couple of weeks. So I just wondered if Tara or possibly other people wanted to comment on whether is that again as a product of COVID, or is it something that we think we might see more of going forward? And if so, what sort of areas do you think that's likely to occur in?
Tara, would you like to lead us on that?
Yeah, Tess, thank you for the comment and the question. I think you're absolutely right. I think what we know and we're continuing to learn about China is that it's very dynamic in its engagement and it's changing. And so it's not surprising to see Beijing engaging not only bilaterally, but at the regional level as well. During COVID, we had a lot of that meeting with Pacific Island leaders. So I'm not surprised at all that Beijing would see regional organization as a way of approaching its diplomatic relationship with the region.
Terence, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, this actually came up really recently. Somebody had approached me also with a question on this, and obviously we are seeing a restructuring towards multilateral relations between China and the Pacific, but the person who approached me was quite nervous about it. Like this was part of China's grand plan to take over the Pacific. But what I pointed out is if you look at other Asian countries, Japan, Korea, they've been doing this in the Pacific for years. They've been organizing their relationships multilaterally, I think. And you see the US the same. Anthony Blinken, he comes to the Pacific, he meets with all of the leaders, not just bilaterally. So this is a way that at a higher level, a lot of countries conduct their relations with the Pacific. So it's not really surprising that it's kind of taken that turn. I don't know if it's fully because of COVID, but I think it's something that you kind of see with other countries as well, a typical way that they handle the higher level meetings. So I think it's, as Tara said, it's kind of expected that it would go this way, but it's also something that we see other countries that are not really viewed with as much maybe fear or anxiety also conduct their relations in the Pacific.
I think if I could add just quickly too, I think when we talk about China, we need to unpack it a little bit, because during the COVID pandemic, you saw involvement of non-state actors from China. So for example, when the Pacific Island Forum created the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway to coordinate inputs for the response to the COVID pandemic, the first equipment that came from the Jack Ma Foundation, the Chinese Bill Gates, now in disgrace, but at the time a player. So that it's not just simply the Chinese government. You've seen also Chinese corporations active in Pacific Island countries switch resources to respond to COVID. So CCECC, major road building project in Vanuatu, but they helped build an infectious ward at the Port Vila Hospital. So it's not simply the Chinese state, but non-state entities that are also players in this area. I think I just also add, though, that China is engaging regionally, but Chinese diplomacy is not always well received in the region. The Chinese diplomats can be as ugly and clumsy as US and Australian diplomats on occasions. I was in Nauru in 2018, where Chinese diplomats stormed from the meeting as a gesture of anger at the host government, which was aligned with Taiwan. And it really angered a lot of Pacific Island governments who felt that this was disrespectful to their status as sovereign nations. So I don't think we need to see this as all a one-way process with China expanding its influence. I think it's quite a contradictory process. Chinese diplomacy is learning a lot, and I think it won a lot of ground during the Trump years and the Morrison years around climate policy. I think that would change under the Biden and Albanese governments. So it's not a neat one-way process of rising Chinese influence. In fact, Chinese diplomacy has been pretty ugly at times in the region and has alienated a lot of people who in the broad picture are eager to build friendships with all partners, be it China, Korea, Indonesia, Australia, United States, and so on.
It's
Yeah.
worth noting also that the US has not been constant in its collective meetings with Pacific leaders. Under Obama, I think there were 2 handshake meetings with him. Trump met with the COFA leaders, and we heard that he asked about golf courses on their island. But there is talk now of Biden inviting the leaders to the White House, and I believe that might be quite imminent. I think, sorry.
Terence, could I just add one more thing to Nick's point? I think certainly in Fiji, the incident at GPH, right, between diplomats from Taiwan and the PRC, caused a lot of damage in terms of how people in civil society viewed behaviors of Chinese diplomats. But I would also add that and we're obviously anticipating Wang Yi's visit to the region, but visit diplomacy has been a very effective mechanism for the PRC. And coming back to Terence's point, that the scarcity of the top leadership meeting is very much in evidence. And I mean, just a very cursory look at the times that Xi Jinping has interacted with the Pacific political leaders, whether it's in the region, visits to PNG or Fiji, or just visit diplomacy to Beijing, has its it has its ceremonial aspects, but it's certainly an important marker, a signal, certainly. So I think that aspect is also quite something that China has developed.
Thank you, Henrikh. So we have a question from Alan Tidwell, who is the director of the Center for Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University, who is actually in Sydney at the moment. And his question is as follows. The evolving circumstances around great power competition in the Pacific. Could the panelists look into the future and offer views around the prospects for the Blue Pacific? Will strategic competition drown out the Blue Pacific? So who wants to have a go at predicting the future? No?
Yeah, go on now, Jess.
Okay, yeah, I'll let Tara go a second because he's going to say something much smarter than I'm going to. But I think from my perspective, although I think there'll probably be other ones, I think the Blue Pacific, this concept and the idea of it is at this point very deeply rooted in the way that Pacific countries talk about themselves. And my worry, I think, more about this Blue Pacific ideal and framing the Pacific as a Blue Pacific continent is not so much the great power issue if we're looking really at China, but more about MPS and more about this relationship with Micronesian countries. And as Tara talked about in the beginning, the regional architecture. If the regional architecture breaks down, I mean, it's already so complicated, the regional architecture, but if PIF breaks down and it ceases to be the really unifying body that it has been and nobody takes over, I think that's when we really have to start worrying about the future of the Blue Pacific, because Micronesia is key. I mean, the fact that these countries can all come together, especially from far in the north, and come together and have these statements like the declaration, even MPS still signed it last year, but the Declaration on Maritime Boundaries, and given the effects of sea level rise. These are remarkable things that the Pacific is doing, leading the way in many legal standards on climate change that really will start to hurt if MPS doesn't come back to PIF, or if another organization can't take over. I think that brings everyone together. So I think that's the concern, to me, that's more pressing than some of these, looking at, from a Pacific perspective, looking at China and other countries within the Pacific, although obviously that is another concern, but just the unity and the breaks in the unity, I think, is a really, really important thing to look at. Thanks.
Tara?
Yeah, I was just going to say that everything I predicted about the future is usually wrong. So it's quite difficult. But I was going to say something similar to what Jess mentioned, that it all depends on what happens in the Pacific Islands, particularly with the regional organizations. And perhaps it gives an opportunity for Pacific Island countries to think through carefully about the regional architecture and whether what we've had since the 1970s up until now is what we want moving forward, or is there another way of reorganizing the region? And whether the Pacific Island Forum is at the center, or is it other organizations that will be at the center of this future of Pacific regionalism? I think Greg Fry and Sandra Todd talked about the new Pacific diplomacy. And so the question is, what does that new Pacific diplomacy look like, given the many regional organizations that we have, and also given what we've seen at the Pacific Islands Forum? So what will happen, Alan, I think depends on the Pacific more than the competition between China and the US.
Interesting. I think the question is a key one that Alan posed. He posed it in context of the Blue Pacific, but I think it's a key one that we talked about earlier today, and it's in our introduction to the book. To what extent can Pacific countries continue to leverage this competition, and at what point will they be sort of submerged by the intensity of the competition? And I think we're beginning to see that in the Solomon Islands situation. I mean, the language that's coming out of that situation is pretty threatening. So it's the question of outside powers trying to influence through carrots, but there's also sticks being wielded now with red lines being cited, and you know, the US statement which says, which doesn't get specific, but it says we will have to act accordingly if the Chinese set up a base in Solomons. So I do think that that's a key question for us to think about. I thought it was unfortunate that in the case of the US, as Tara referred to earlier, the major piece of legislation in Congress, which would put large amount of resources into Pacific, sort of co-opted the term Blue Pacific. It's called the Blue Pacific Act, and I thought that was an unfortunate co-option of something which, as Tara argues, is a Pacific response to other people mapping their interests on the region. I think we're back to the audience, and yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. In the back, sorry.
My name is Chope, and I'm a student here at ADU. And I just wanted to say hi to Professor Tarcisius, Henrikh, and Nick, and just tell Professor we're still waiting for it. I still have your cover, Professor Tarcisius. Very interesting. I just wanted to share one thing before I ask my question. The issue of the Micronesian bloc has always been very fascinating to me, especially when this leadership struggle was happening in Suva. I remember it quite vividly because everybody in Suva, at least those that were following the appointment of who was going to be the next head, was going on late into the night. And there were vehicles going up and down USP and through USP, because the forum is just behind or sitting side by side with USP, and all these different vehicles were going up and down. And there were clear indications that the leaders themselves were moving about in terms of what they wanted or how they saw the next leadership was going to be. But the reason why I wanted to share that is because I realized in these discussions that the role of the forum is going to be so crucial, especially in the next couple of months, especially with the schedule of the meeting changing continuously with this overwhelming shifts that's happening over and over again. And I hope that obviously that should hold out. My question is specifically to Jessica. I'm very fascinated with what you shared, your chapter. And I'm also tying that into what the new Foreign Minister of Australia has just mentioned at the end of her little address to the Pacific about cultural diplomacy. And just as I was mentioned before, the co-opting of language. And I've become particularly concerned about how Indigenous language and Indigenous modes of approaches have become co-opted almost overnight, even by state representatives who are part of the culture without due consideration. So in your research, I wonder, is there a point of, or a major, there's a lot that you could probably unpack, but just one major point of caution, if you will, towards sort of state intent in proposing cultural diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, in building relationships. What's a major point of caution that you can probably share? It seems as though that things have changed with the new government in Australia, and elections are coming up for certain countries in the Pacific. Now.
Thanks, Joby.
Thanks. That's a great question. I think there are different levels of caution. or different types of caution we would give. Yeah, because someone came to me with when the Australian, when Penny Wong had said that they're going to be using the in First Nations in their foreign policy, and was really excited. I'm like, no, we have to wait until we see how they do this, because really this is, again, if we look at Australia, we look at the history of Taiwan, what has happened to Indigenous or First Nations peoples. I think the last thing they need is then their concepts to be taken up and used in an inappropriate or insensitive way. So within settler colonies, obviously a lot of work has to be done if you're going to take those and put those into policies to make sure that that's what the people who came up with those concepts want. And if they do not want it, that should not happen. And I think that is my major point of caution for settler colonies, that it's nice to say that you're going to respect Indigenous peoples and think that by putting their concepts into policies you are, but you could so easily take these concepts and twist them in such a way that it becomes, I mean, and we see this easily with so many things that happen, becomes so disrespectful, and then you're using it as policy. So I think in that concept where there's a settler colony setup, you have to be extremely careful. Now within Tuvalu, I think we, had to work really hard in putting Indigenous concepts but cultural concepts from Tuvalu into the foreign policy. But a major issue that, we see as well, although at a different level, is just that, again, people may not necessarily understand these concepts in the same way. You're taking cultural concepts that are key to the foundation of a society, and then you're trying to extrapolate them to international relations. And our minister may understand it one way, and cultural elders may understand it another way. And so again, it becomes a thing where consultation is really key. And the terms, they have to be terms that everyone recognizes. It's a bit easier in non-settler states. But again, if you are, Tuvalu is a more homogenous place, but if you're in somewhere like Solomon Islands, PNG, it would become much harder to do something like this. So I think that the caution is really that you have to be extremely careful in bringing even a term into these policies, and really the level of consultation and the level of care. So that would be the caution that I would give, but it really is up to people to take the time to do this right, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Jess. Unfortunately, we've actually run out of time, so we're coming up for a break. But before we break, I want to thank the panelists for their excellent presentations, thank the audience for their excellent questions and comments, and apologize to those people who haven't had a chance to ask their questions yet. But we will have another panel session starting at 11:45. It's just a very brief break. And so hold your questions if you have one, and I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to plug it in to the next panel. So thank you so much, and we'll see you back at 11:45.